Ethan Callahan hadn't laid a hand on another living soul in 15 years. Not a handshake, not an embrace, nothing. Then a stranger's fist struck his door in the dead of a summer night, and the woman who collapsed into his arms called herself his bride. He'd written no letter. He'd asked for no wife. But when her knees buckled and he caught her before she hit the porch boards, something inside him, something buried for 15 years, cracked wide open. Before we ride into this story, hit subscribe and follow along to the very end, and drop the name of the city you're watching from tonight. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Ethan Callahan hadn't shaken another man's hand in 3 years. He kept it that way on purpose. When Roy Tanner rode up from the barquet spread with a bill of sale and an outstretched palm, Ethan just nodded at the paper signed, where Roy pointed and stepped back before their fingers could touch. "You're a hard man to do business with, Callahan," Roy said, folding the paper into his vest. "I do business fine. Just don't care much for the shaking part. 15 years up here alone'll do that to a man, I reckon." Ethan didn't answer. He turned and walked back toward the barn, and Roy Tanner didn't follow, because everybody in Larkspur County knew better than to follow Ethan Callahan anywhere he didn't invite you. Inside the barn, Ethan pressed his palm flat against the post he'd driven into the ground the summer his wife and daughter were buried, and he breathed until the shaking in his chest settled. He did this most days. Nobody saw it. Nobody needed to. He was 38 years old, built like something the mountain had carved rather than born, and the town of Larkspur had long since stopped inventing reasons to visit his ranch. They called him the man who married the mountains. They said it kind mostly the way you'd talk about a dog too mean to pet, but too loyal to shoot. He didn't mind the name. It was true enough. What he minded was pity. And pity was the one thing Larkspur handed out for free. Down at the Mercantile, Ruth Ann Colby was already talking before the bell over the door finished ringing. "You hear the stage brought someone in for the Callahan place." Doc Whitfield set down the ledger he'd been squinting at. "Say that again." "A woman, young, come in on the noon stage asking after Ethan Callahan's ranch bold as brass, saying she's his intended." Ethan Callahan doesn't have an intended. Ethan Callahan doesn't have a Christmas card list. Well, she's got a letter says otherwise. Showed it to Sheriff Briggs before she started walking. Walking, mind you, all the way up that mountain road with one bag and a hole worn clean through her boot. Doc Whitfield rubbed his jaw. "That's near 6 miles of bad road." "I know how far it is, Amos. I'm telling you what I saw." Clara Whitmore had walked further than 6 miles in her life, and she'd do it again before she'd let anyone see her cry over it. Her boot had split somewhere past the Second Creek crossing, and every step after that ground gravel straight into her heel. But she didn't stop, because stopping meant thinking. And thinking meant remembering exactly how she'd ended up walking alone into unfamiliar mountains with nothing but a carpet bag, and a letter she'd read so many times the folds had gone soft as cloth. "Dear Miss Whitmore, I am a rancher of good standing 38 years, seeking a wife of sound character to share my home in the Colorado mountains. I have land cattle and a roof that does not leak. I ask only honesty in return. E. Callahan." She'd memorized it the way a drowning woman memorizes the shape of a rope. When the ranch gate finally came into view, split timber weathered gray, a house set back against the tree line, her legs simply stopped answering her. She made it 3 more steps before the ground came up to meet her. Chind. Ethan heard the fence rail rattle before he heard her hit the dirt, and he was moving before he'd finished deciding to move the way a man moves when instinct outruns thought. She was already crumpling when he reached her and he caught her under the arms before her head could strike the post, and for one long suspended second, he held a stranger's full weight against his chest and felt something in him seize up entirely. 15 years. 15 years since he'd held another person, and it took a collapsing stranger to remind his arms they still remembered how. "Ma'am." His voice came out rougher than he meant it. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, gray eyes exhausted, sharp, even half-conscious, and the first thing she said wasn't "thank you" or "help me." The first thing she said was, "Don't, I can stand." "You're not standing. You're near flat on the ground. Then set me down gentle and I'll stand myself." He almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he lowered her carefully until her back found the fence post, and he crouched in front of her forearms on his knees, studying her the way he'd study a horse he wasn't sure he trusted yet. "You got a name?" "Clara Whitmore." She said it like a challenge, chin lifting, even as her hands trembled in her lap. "And you're Ethan Callahan, or I've walked 6 miles up the wrong mountain. I'm Callahan." He watched her reach into her bag with hands that shook and produce a folded, soft, worn letter, holding it out to him like proof in a trial. "What's that?" "Your letter, Mr. Callahan, the one you sent for a wife of sound character. I'm answering it." He didn't take it. He looked at it the way a man looks at a snake he isn't sure is dead. "Ma'am, I never wrote that letter." Her hand didn't drop. "I beg your pardon. I said I never wrote it. I don't know who did, but it wasn't me." He straightened up, put some distance between them, the old wariness climbing back into his shoulders like a coat he'd never taken off. "I didn't send for anybody." For a moment, she just stared at him, and he watched something in her face go from disbelief to something harder. Something that looked like she was doing arithmetic on exactly how much trouble she was in. "That's not possible," she said, quiet now. "I'm telling you it's true. I sold my mother's ring for stage fare, Mr. Callahan. I told the entire town of Millbrook I was going to be married. I am not—" Her voice cracked just barely, and she clamped down on it so fast he almost missed it. "I am not turning around and walking 6 miles back down that road to tell them it was all a mistake. I didn't say you had to turn around this minute. I said I didn't write the letter. Then somebody wrote it for you, and I intend to find out who, because either way, sir, I have nowhere else to go tonight." She said it flat, not begging, just stating a fact she clearly hated having to state. And something about the set of her jaw, when she said it proud, even while admitting the worst thing about her situation, made Ethan Callahan do something he hadn't done for anybody in 15 years. He offered his hand to help her up. She looked at it, looked at him, and pulled herself up off the fence post without touching it at all. "I said I can stand," she reminded him. "Suit yourself." He pulled his hand back, feeling foolish for offering it. Feeling something else, too, that he didn't have a name for yet. "Barn's got a room in the back. Used to be for a hired man. It's got a door that locks from the inside, and it's yours tonight. Tomorrow we go into town and get this sorted. And if it can't be sorted, then we'll sort that too. But you're not sleeping on the road, and I'm not the kind of man who sends a woman off a mountain in the dark, whatever else folks say about me." Clara studied him a long moment. Really studied him the way he realized nobody had studied him in years. Not with pity, not with fear, just plain assessment. And finally, she nodded once sharp. "Fair enough, Mr. Callahan. Show me the room." The hired man's room hadn't been touched since the hired man left 3 winters back, and Ethan dragged the shutters open. Himself, beat the dust off the mattress with his bare hands, muttering under his breath, the whole while about letters he never wrote, and women who wouldn't take a man's help, even when they were falling down. Clara stood in the doorway and watched him work. "You didn't have to do that. Didn't have to leave you sleeping in dirt either." "I've slept in worse." He straightened up dust on his forearms and looked at her properly for the first time since he'd caught her at the gate. Travel-worn. Thin in a way that spoke of meals skipped rather than meals missed. A split boot she was trying to hide by standing with her weight on the other foot. And underneath all of it, a spine that hadn't bent once since she'd hit the ground outside his fence. "How old are you, Miss Whitmore?" 27. "Why?" "No reason." He picked his hat up off the bedpost where he'd set it, turned it once in his hands. "There's stew on the stove if you're hungry. Wasn't expecting company, so it's plain." I don't need charity, Mr. Callahan. It's not charity, it's supper. Man's got to eat, may as well eat with somebody else for once. He said it before he had thought it through, and the words landed strange in the room, strange enough that he saw her blink, saw something flicker behind those gray eyes that wasn't quite suspicion, and wasn't quite surprise either. All right, she said finally. Supper. Then tomorrow you take me to whoever's got answers about that letter. Tomorrow. He agreed and set his hat back on his head and left her to the room before he said something else he hadn't thought through first. Byakuda. She came to the table 20 minutes later with her hair reworked and her boots off, walking in stockinged feet across floorboards Ethan hadn't swept in longer than he'd admit, and she sat across from him without being asked. And she ate like a woman who'd learned the hard way not to trust that a second meal was coming. He watched her from the corner of his eye and said nothing about it. This is good, she said, eventually surprised, like she hadn't meant to say it out loud. Ain't much. It's more than I've had in 2 days. He set his spoon down. 2 days. The stage doesn't feed you, Mr. Callahan. And I wasn't about to spend what little I had on food when I thought I was riding toward a home and a husband. She said it plain, no self-pity in it, just fact laid on the table between them like another dish. Foolish, I suppose, trusting a letter that far. Not foolish. Somebody set out to fool you. That's different. Doesn't feel different sitting here. He didn't have an answer for that, so he gave her the only thing he had, which was silence and a second helping of stew ladled into her bowl before she could refuse it. I didn't ask for more, she said. I know. Eat it anyway. For the first time since she'd fallen at his gate, Clara Whitmore almost smiled. Doc Whitfield was the first to raise the letter's mystery proper 3 days on, when Ethan rode into Larkspur, with Clara beside him on the wagon bench, both of them stiff and silent the whole 6 miles down, because neither one had found a comfortable way to sit beside a stranger who might be your ruin or your rescue, and nobody yet knew which. Ethan Callahan. Doc Whitfield came out from behind the mercantile counter, wiping his hands on his apron. Heard you had yourself a visitor. Heard right. This is Miss Whitmore. Somebody wrote her a letter claiming to be me. Doc's eyebrows went up toward his hairline. That's so. That's so, Clara said, and produced the letter again, laying it flat on the counter between them. I need to know who sent this. Doc Whitfield read it over, slow, his mouth moving slightly with the words, and when he finished, he looked up at Ethan with an expression Ethan didn't much care for. This is Frank Dell's hand, Doc said. Frank Dell, Ethan repeated, jaw tight. Sure as I'm standing here. I've read enough of his ledger entries down at the land office to know that slant when I see it. Question is, why in God's name Frank Dell would forge you a mail-order bride? Ethan already had a guess forming cold and unpleasant, and he saw the same guess land on Doc Whitfield's face a half-second later. The East parcel, Doc said quietly. What East parcel? Clara looked between them. Ethan's hands had curled into fists on the counter without him deciding to make them do that. There's 80 acres bordering my land that Marsh Holloway's been trying to buy off me for 2 years. Water rights run through it. I've refused him every time he's asked. And Frank Dell works for Holloway, Doc finished. Clara's face had gone very still. Then this letter wasn't about finding you a wife at all. No, ma'am, Ethan said. I don't believe it was. Then what was I? Nobody answered her, because nobody in that mercantile had a kind way to say the word she was clearly already thinking. Bait. Marsh Holloway ran the only bank in 3 counties and half the county besides, and he had a way of smiling that made honest men check their pockets afterward. He came into the mercantile not 10 minutes later, drawn by whatever whisper network moved faster than horses in a town that small, and he tipped his hat to Clara with a courtesy so smooth it made Ethan's neck prickle. Miss Whitmore is at Marsh Holloway. Welcome to Larkspur. Mr. Holloway. Clara's voice had gone careful measured. I understand you may know something about a letter written in Mr. Callahan's name. Holloway's smile didn't waver, not even a fraction. I couldn't say. Frank Dell's a clerk of mine, but a man's private correspondence isn't something I keep track of. Funny, Ethan said. Seeing as you've been after that East parcel 2 years running, and now a stranger shows up at my gate right when I'm distracted enough to maybe finally sell it just to be rid of the mess. That's a serious accusation, Callahan. It's an observation. You want to call it something else, go on ahead. Holloway's eyes moved from Ethan to Clara and back, calculating something, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped the courtesy by half. Miss Whitmore, whatever you were promised, I'd hate to see a young woman stranded out here on false hope. Larkspur's no place for a lady without means. I could arrange stage fare back east if it comes to that. No charge. That's kind, Clara said in a tone that made clear she thought it was anything but. But I didn't come 6 miles up a mountain to be shipped back east by the man who tricked me into coming. Nobody's said I tricked anybody. Nobody's had to, Clara said. I can do arithmetic same as anyone, Mr. Holloway. For just a moment, something ugly flickered behind Marsh Holloway's eyes, something that had nothing to do with land or letters, and everything to do with a woman who wouldn't be handled the way he was used to handling people. Then it was gone, smoothed back under the banker's smile, and he tipped his hat once more. Well, I do hope you find your footing, Miss Whitmore. Larkspur can be a hard place for a woman alone. He turned to Ethan. Callahan, think on that parcel. Offer's still open. He left, and the bell over the door rang too cheerfully behind him. They rode back up the mountain in a silence that had changed shape entirely from the ride down. Clara sat with the letter folded in her lap, staring at nothing, and Ethan drove the wagon with his jaw set hard enough to ache. I'm sorry, he said finally when the town had shrunk behind them. Man used you to get at my land. That's a cowardly thing to do to anybody, and I'm sorry it landed on you. You didn't do it. Don't much matter. You're the one who walked 6 miles on a lie. Clara was quiet a moment, turning the letter over in her hands. For what it's worth, Mr. Callahan, I don't think I'm sorry I came. He glanced over at her surprised. I had nothing in Millbrook, she said simply, like it cost her something to admit it, and she was paying that cost on purpose. A dead father, a mother's ring I already sold, and a town that had decided exactly what kind of woman I was before I'd said a word to defend myself. This letter was a lie, but it got me somewhere new. I intend to make something of that, whatever else it cost me. What kind of woman did they decide you were? She looked at him sideways, testing whether the question was kindness, or just more of the same curiosity that had followed her out of Millbrook. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her, because she answered. The kind who doesn't know her place. I kept my father's books after he passed. Kept them better than the men who tried to take the business from me, which they didn't much appreciate. A woman with a head for figures is a woman who needs correcting in most men's opinion. Not in mine, Ethan said before he'd thought about whether he ought to say it. Clara looked at him a long moment. We'll see, Mr. Callahan. That night, Ethan sat on the porch step long after the house had gone dark, turning the whole mess over in his mind. Frank Dell's forged hand, Holloway's smooth denial, the east parcel that had suddenly become a battlefield he hadn't chosen to fight on. He heard the barn door creak and looked up to see Clara crossing the yard in the moonlight, wrapped in a shawl, unable to sleep any more than he could. Couldn't rest, she said by way of explanation, settling onto the step beside him without asking permission, which he found he didn't mind near as much as he expected to. Neither could I. Do you think he'll try again, Holloway? I think Marsh Holloway's the kind of man who doesn't stop asking a question just because he doesn't like the answer he got the first 10 times. Ethan turned his hat over in his hands, an old habit. I've held that parcel through worse pressure than this. I'll hold it now. Why does it matter so much to you, the land I mean? Truly. He was quiet a long moment, and when he answered, his voice had gone lower, rougher, the way it did when he was reaching for something he didn't often touch. My wife's buried on it, and my daughter beside her. Fever took them both inside of a week 6 years back. I built the fence around that ground myself, plank by plank, so nobody'd ever plow it under or run cattle over it. Holloway wants that water access bad enough he's offered me triple what any surveyor'd call it worth. I'd burn the deed myself before I let him touch it. Clara didn't say she was sorry, didn't reach for him, didn't do any of the soft, useless things people did when they didn't know what else to do with grief that wasn't theirs. She just sat with it silent, letting the weight of what he'd said settle in the space between them without trying to lift it off him too fast. "Thank you," Ethan said after a while, "for not saying you're sorry." "I am sorry. I just didn't see the use in saying it." She pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "My father used to say condolences are for the person giving them mostly. Makes them feel like they've done something. Your father sounds like he had sense. He did. Died anyway. Sense doesn't stop fever any more than it stops men like Holloway." Ethan almost laughed at that, a short, surprised huff of breath, the closest thing to laughter that had come out of him in longer than he could easily count. And Clara glanced over at him, something like satisfaction crossing her face at having drawn it out of him. "Well," she said, "there's a start." "A start to what?" "I haven't decided yet, Mr. Callahan, but I intend to find out." The next morning, Ethan found Frank Dell's forged letter still sitting on the kitchen table where Clara had left it, and beneath it in her own neat, sure hand, a fresh page of figures, a full accounting of the ranch's supplies, laid out clean and orderly, the kind of thing he hadn't kept track of properly since his wife had passed. He found Clara out back, sleeves rolled, mending a section of fence rail that had been broken since before she arrived, working the nails in with steady, practiced strokes that told him this wasn't the first fence she'd ever fixed, whatever Larkspur assumed about a lady from Millbrook. "You didn't have to do the books," he said. "I didn't have anything else to do with my hands this morning, and idle hands make a person think too hard about things they'd rather not." She didn't look up from the nail she was setting. "Your inventory's a mess, Mr. Callahan. You're low on flour and you don't know it, and you've been overpaying Tanner for feed by near a third." That's so. She drove the nail home with one final strike and straightened up, wiping her palms on her skirt. Gray eyes meeting his, without a flicker of apology in them. "You said you needed honesty in that letter somebody forged in your name. I don't know what kind of wife that letter was written to summon Mr. Callahan, but I know what kind of woman walked up this mountain, and she's not in the habit of sitting idle while a good man gets robbed blind by his own supplier." Ethan looked at her at the fence rail she'd fixed, without being asked the ledger she'd corrected, without being asked the fierce, unbending set of her jaw that hadn't softened once since she'd hit the ground outside his gate, and felt something shift loose in his chest that had been locked tight for 15 years. "Miss Whitmore," he said slowly, "I believe you'd best plan on staying a while longer, least till we settle this business with Holloway proper." "Is that an invitation, Mr. Callahan, or a rescue?" "Neither," he said. "Way I see it, you're not the one needs rescuing around here." For the second time since she'd arrived, Clara Whitmore almost smiled, and this time she let it show. But even as she did far down the mountain road, a rider in a dark coat was turning his horse toward the Callahan ranch, carrying instructions from Marsh Holloway that would make sure this fragile, uncertain peace didn't last the week. Ethan didn't see the rider until the horse was already at the tree line, and by then Clara had seen him too, her hammer stopping mid-swing against the fence rail. "Somebody's coming," she said. "I see him." The rider came on slow, unhurried, the kind of slow that told Ethan the man wasn't lost and wasn't in trouble. He was looking. Looking at the barn, looking at the cabin, looking longest of all at the fenced-off ground on the east side where two markers stood beneath a cottonwood tree. Ethan was moving before he decided to move, same as he had at the gate 3 days back. Only this time, the thing pulling him forward wasn't instinct toward a falling woman. It was something colder. "Help you with something," Ethan called out, planting himself between the rider and the fence line, without seeming to plant himself at all. The rider reined up. He was younger than Ethan expected, clean-shaven, wearing a coat too fine for ranch work, and boots that had never touched a stirrup with real purpose. "Name's Cutter, Silas Cutter. Mr. Holloway sent me up to have a look at the boundary line. Says there's some confusion on the survey." "There's no confusion. I had it surveyed myself 2 years back." "Mr. Holloway's got a different survey, says otherwise." Then Mr. Holloway's survey is wrong, and you can ride on back down and tell him so. Cutter's eyes drifted past Ethan toward Clara, lingering there a beat too long. This the woman folks are talking about. This is Miss Whitmore. She's got nothing to do with property lines. Funny how she showed up right when the lines got disputed. Cutter smiled, easy, unbothered. Small world. Clara set the hammer down against the fence post, wiped her palms on her skirt, and walked toward them without being asked, which Ethan hadn't expected, and found himself grateful for anyway. Mr. Cutter, she said, if Mr. Holloway wants a boundary dispute settled, he can send a licensed surveyor with paperwork, not a man on a fine horse who can't be bothered to dismount and show respect to a rancher on his own land. Until then, you're trespassing, and I believe Mr. Callahan asked you to leave. Something flickered behind Cutter's easy smile. Surprise, maybe that a woman had spoken to him like that? Or maybe just the particular annoyance of a man used to being listened to instead of dismissed. Ma'am, I don't believe this concerns you. It concerns me plenty, seeing as I'm standing on the ground you're disputing. Cutter's jaw tightened. He looked at Ethan, clearly hoping for a man to overrule her, and found nothing there but agreement written plain across Ethan's face. You heard the lady, Ethan said. Ride on. Cutter turned his horse slow, deliberate, making clear he was leaving on his own time and nobody else's. At the tree line he paused and looked back. Mr. Holloway don't like being told no twice, Callahan. You'd do well to remember that. He rode off, and Ethan stood watching the space where he'd disappeared long after the hoofbeats faded, a knot forming low in his stomach that had nothing to do with the heat. That wasn't about a survey, Clara said quietly. No, ma'am, it wasn't. What was it about, then? Ethan didn't answer right away. He walked to the fence line Cutter had been studying, crouched down, and ran his fingers along the wire until they caught on something, a clean-cut, deliberate low, where a man crouching could reach it without being seen from the house. He wasn't looking, Ethan said. He was marking. By the time they discovered the second cut wire down along the western pasture, where 6 head of cattle usually grazed, the sun had dropped low enough to throw long shadows across the grass, and the pasture itself was empty. They're gone, Clara said, breathless, from the run down the hill. All of them. Not gone. Scattered. Ethan was already moving toward the barn, already thinking in the practical, urgent shorthand of a man who'd lost stock before and knew exactly how fast a scattered herd could turn into a dead herd if a storm came or a ravine caught them wrong. There's a drop-off past the second ridge. Cattle spook, they don't think they just run and running downhill in the dark. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I'm coming with you, Clara said. It's near dark. It's rough ground. I've ridden rougher ground than this mountain's got to offer, Mr. Callahan, and you'll cover twice the ground with 2 riders instead of 1. Waste less breath arguing and more time saddling. He looked at her for one long second, really looked the way he had that first night in the hired man's room, and something in her face told him arguing further would cost more time than it saved. There's a mare in the second stall. Answers to Bess. She's steady. Then saddle her while I find a coat. It's going to get cold. Mod. They found the herd 40 minutes later, strung out along the ridge trail in the deepening dark, 4 head bunched nervous, near a stand of pine, and 2 more further on, dangerously close to the drop where the ground fell away into rock and scrub 30 feet down. There, Clara said, pointing, and Ethan followed her finger to the 2 strays' hooves, shifting near the edge, spooked by something neither of them could see. Snake, maybe, or a cat scent on the wind. Ethan was already dismounting, moving slow, the careful, unhurried walk of a man who understood that fast movement now meant dead cattle in 30 seconds. Stay back. I'll circle round from the far side, ease them off the edge. What do you need me to do? Hold the 4 that are bunched. Don't let them bolt toward me while I'm working the other 2, or you'll send the whole lot over that edge at once. Clara nodded, steadied her horse, and Ethan watched her settle into the work with a competence that surprised him even now. Voice low and even murmuring something to the nervous animals that he couldn't hear, but that clearly worked because the four heads stayed bunched instead of scattering. He came around wide, slow-talking low to the two strays the whole way, and for one terrible second, the nearer one shifted its weight toward the drop instead of away from it. Hooves sliding on loose scree, and Ethan's heart seized up so hard, he felt it in his throat. "Easy," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Easy now. Ain't nothing out here worth dying for. Come on back." The steer hesitated, head swinging, and then slow reluctant turned back toward the herd. Ethan didn't breathe again until both strays had rejoined the group, until the whole scattered herd stood bunched and steadying under the darkening sky, and only then did he let himself look over at Clara, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read in the dim light. "You did that well," she said. "Had practice." "No, I mean you did that well." She said it again slower, like she wanted him to understand. She meant something more than the compliment sounded like. "Most men would have moved fast, tried to force it. You didn't. Forcing a scared animal just makes it more scared. Learned that the hard way a long time back." "I imagine you learned a great deal the hard way." He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. They rode the herd back toward the home pasture in a silence that had turned companionable somewhere in the last hour. The kind of silence two people share after surviving something together. And it wasn't until they'd penned the last steer and closed the gate that Ethan said what he'd been turning over the whole ride back. That wire didn't cut itself, and cattle don't wander 3 ridges in one afternoon on their own account. Somebody drove them. Cutter. Or somebody Cutter sent, more likely. Man like that don't dirty his own boots. Clara's jaw set hard, in a way Ethan was starting to recognize as the shape her fear took when she refused to let it look like fear. "This is my fault." "It is not. Mr. Callahan, be honest. You had no trouble from Holloway before I walked up your road. I had 2 years of trouble from Holloway before you walked up my road. You just made him impatient enough to start acting the fool instead of just asking polite." Ethan pulled the gate latch shut, tested it twice out of habit. "That's not your doing. That's his. You don't have to be kind about it." "I'm not being kind. I'm being accurate." He turned to face her, fully hat pushed back, the exhaustion of the last hour plain in the lines of his face, but something steadier underneath it too. "You didn't ask to be used in his scheme any more than I asked for him coveting my land. We're both just standing in the way of a man who don't like being told no. That makes us the same kind of trouble to him, not each other's trouble." Clara was quiet a moment, studying him in the near dark. "You're not at all what Larkspur says you are, you know." "What's Larkspur say I am?" "Cold, unreachable. A man married to his mountain, and nothing else." She almost smiled. "I've known you 4 days, Mr. Callahan, and I've already seen you run a mile downhill in the dark to save 2 head of cattle from a fall and talk them back from a ledge like they were children you loved. That's not a cold man." Ethan felt something warm crawl up the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the exertion of the evening. Folks believe what's easiest to believe. Easier to call a man cold than to wonder what happened to make him quiet. "What did happen truly, beyond what you told me on the porch?" He looked at her a long moment, weighing something, and Clara waited without pushing, which he noticed and appreciated more than he could easily have said. "Another time," he said finally. "It's late, and you've had a hard enough evening without me adding to it." "All right," she said, and didn't press, and something about the ease with which she let it go told him she understood the difference between curiosity and demand better than most people he'd known in his life. 2 days later, Larkspur held its monthly social at the church hall, and Ruth Ann Colby made certain with the particular efficiency of a woman who considered gossip a civic duty that every soul in 3 counties knew Ethan Callahan would be bringing a woman nobody could vouch for. "You don't have to go," Ethan said, standing in the cabin doorway that evening, watching Clara fuss with a dress she'd mended twice over to make presentable. "I can tell them you're feeling poorly, and give them one more reason to whisper that I'm hiding something. No, Mr. Callahan. I've run from enough rooms in my life. I don't intend to start running from this one." "They'll be cruel." They've been cruel to me before. I know the shape of it." She smoothed the dress one final time, chin lifting in that way he'd come to recognize as her bracing herself. "What I don't know is whether you'll stand next to me when they are, or whether you'll let me stand alone." The question landed harder than he expected, and he answered it without hesitation, because there wasn't any hesitation in him to give. "I don't let people I brought stand alone. Never have." Something in her face eased just slightly. "Then I suppose we're going to a social Mr. Callahan." The church hall was warm with lamplight and crowded with the particular noise of a small town's entire population crammed into one room, and the noise dropped not all at once, but in a slow spreading wave, the moment Ethan Callahan walked in with a woman on his arm that nobody in Larkspur had agreed to accept yet. Ruth Ann Colby found them within the first 2 minutes, her smile sharp as a blade wrapped in silk. "Miss Whitmore, what a surprise seeing you still here. I confess when I heard the letter was forged, I assumed you'd have moved on by now." "I don't move on from things that easily, Mrs. Colby." "No, I don't suppose you do." Ruth Ann's eyes traveled over Clara's mended dress, lingering on the seams, with obvious appraisal. "It must be difficult arriving somewhere with so little and having to rely on a stranger's charity." "It's not charity," Ethan said before Clara could answer. "She's earned her keep every day she's been on my land and then some. You want to talk about reliance? Ruth Ann, maybe ask yourself how many meals your own household's had thanks to credit. My ranch extended your husband last winter." The color drained from Ruth Ann's face fast enough that Clara had to bite down on the corner of her mouth to keep from smiling outright. "That's ungentlemanly, Ethan Callahan. So's talking down to a guest in a house of God, but here we all are." Ruth Ann opened her mouth, found nothing sufficient to say, and retreated toward the punch table, with what dignity she could gather, and Clara turned to Ethan with something like wonder on her face. "You didn't have to do that." "Told you already. I don't let people I brought stand alone." But the room hadn't finished with them yet. Doc Whitfield's wife, kinder than most, but no less curious, approached with a plate of biscuits and a question dressed up as concern. "Miss Whitmore, dear, if you don't mind my asking, what will you do if the matter with Mr. Holloway doesn't resolve favorably? A woman can't simply stay indefinitely on a bachelor's ranch. Folks will talk." "Folks are already talking, Mrs. Whitfield. I don't imagine my leaving would stop that." "No, I suppose not. Still, there's the matter of propriety." Clara's spine straightened, and Ethan watched her gather herself for what he suspected was a fight she'd had to fight more than once in her life. "Mrs. Whitfield, I kept my father's ledgers clean for 11 years, while men twice my age tried to convince the bank I couldn't add a column of figures. I buried my mother alone because there was no one left to help me dig. I walked 6 miles up a mountain on a split boot rather than lie down and quit. I think I've earned the right to worry about my own propriety without a town full of strangers doing it for me." The hall had gone quiet enough to hear the lamp wicks hiss. Mrs. Whitfield blinked clearly, unprepared for the force of the answer, and it was Doc Whitfield himself who broke the silence, stepping up beside his wife with an expression that looked almost proud. "Well said, Miss Whitmore. Well said indeed." He turned to the room at large, raising his voice just enough to carry. "And while we're speaking plain, seems to me a woman who fixes fences, balances books, and pulls cattle back from a cliff edge in the dark has done more honest work in this county in 4 days than some folks manage in a season of gossip." A ripple of low laughter moved through the room, some of it uncomfortable, but not all of it, and Clara felt something in her chest loosen for the first time since she'd stepped through the hall doors. Ethan leaned down slightly close enough that only she could hear him. "Cliff Edge stories already made the rounds, I see. Small towns. Smallest thing about them." The evening might have settled into something almost pleasant after that. A few careful conversations, a shared plate of food. The particular relief of a battle survived if Marsh Holloway hadn't walked through the hall doors an hour later, with Frank Dell trailing a half-step behind him, looking like a man being marched somewhere he didn't want to go. The room's temperature dropped again differently this time, the way a room does when the person everyone secretly answers to walks in. "Ethan? Miss Whitmore." Holloway's smile was doing its usual work, smooth and unbothered, but there was something sharper underneath it tonight, something Ethan recognized from a lifetime of reading men across a poker table. "Glad to see you both looking well considering the trouble with your stock." "Word travels fast," Ethan said. "Small town. Shame about the scattered herd. Dangerous business cattle near a ridgeline in the dark. Man could lose a great deal more than livestock chasing after strays like that." It wasn't a threat spoken plain. Holloway was too careful for that, but Ethan heard the shape of one hiding underneath the words, and beside him he felt Clara go very still. "We managed fine," Ethan said. "Every head accounted for." Good, I'm relieved to hear it." Holloway's eyes shifted to Clara, and his smile widened by a fraction that made her stomach tighten. "Miss Whitmore, I wonder if I might have a private word. Business matter. Won't take but a moment." "Anything you have to say, you can say in front of Mr. Callahan." "I'd rather not embarrass you in front of the whole hall, ma'am. It concerns a debt." The word landed in the air between them like a dropped plate. "A debt," Clara repeated, careful, controlled. "I received word from a business associate back in Millbrook. Seems there's an outstanding sum owed against your late father's accounts, a debt that transferred to you upon his passing, as these things sometimes do. $200, I believe the figure was." "That's a lie." Clara's voice didn't rise, but it cut through the murmur of the room clean as a blade. "My father's accounts were settled in full before he died. I kept those books myself, Mr. Holloway. There is no debt." "I only report what I've been told, Miss Whitmore. The associate seemed quite confident in the figure. Says he intends to send someone to collect if the matter isn't resolved soon. I only mention it as a courtesy, wouldn't want you caught unprepared." Ethan stepped forward close enough now that his shoulder brushed Clara's, a wall placed deliberately between her and whatever Holloway intended next. "Funny how every piece of bad news about Miss Whitmore seems to come through you these days, Marsh. First a letter you claim you know nothing about. Now a debt from a man nobody's named. I don't control what news reaches me, Callahan. No, but you sure seem to control what you do with it once it does." Ethan's voice had gone low, hard. The particular quiet that Clara had already learned meant he was closer to anger than his tone let on. "You want to send a debt collector up my mountain, you go right ahead and try. But you'd best have real paperwork with a real name on it, because I've had about enough of your associates and your surveys and your letters that never seem to have an author anybody can find." The two men stared at each other, and for one long moment the entire hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which one would break first. It was Frank Dell who broke instead, a small sound, almost a cough. And when Ethan glanced over, the young clerk's face had gone the pale, sick color of a man carrying something he badly wanted to put down. "Mr. Dell," Clara said, turning toward him, her voice softening just slightly. "You look unwell." I'm fine, ma'am. Just the heat." Frank Holloway said sharp, "We should be going." But Frank Dell didn't move right away. He looked at Clara, and something passed across his young face that looked almost like an apology, quickly buried, quickly swallowed back down. "Frank," Holloway said again, harder. This time Dell moved, following his employer toward the door, and Ethan watched them go, with the cold certainty settling in his stomach that whatever Holloway was building toward Frank Dell already knew more of it than he wanted to. They didn't speak much on the ride home, both of them turning the evening over in their own private silence until they were most of the way up the mountain road, and Clara finally said what had been sitting heavy in her chest since the hall. "There is no debt, Ethan." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and he felt it land somewhere low in his chest, warm and unexpected. "I believe you." "You don't know that for certain. You've known me 4 days. 5 near enough. And I've watched you fix a fence balance, a ledger, pull cattle off a cliff edge, and stand up to Ruth Ann Colby without breaking a sweat. A woman like that doesn't leave debts unpaid behind her. She settles her own accounts, same as she settles everything else." He glanced over at her. "I believe you because I've seen enough of who you are to know Holloway's lying, same as he lied about that letter." Clara was quiet a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone smaller, more uncertain than he'd heard it since that first collapse at the gate. What if he sends someone anyway? A man claiming to collect papers or no papers. Then he'll find me standing between you and that man, same as I stood between you and Holloway tonight. Ethan's hands tightened slightly on the reins. I meant what I told you, Clara. I don't let people I've brought stand alone. Wasn't lying about that, and I'm not fixing to start. Something in the way he said her name, plain unadorned. No, ma'am, or Miss Whitmore wrapped around it, made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear of Holloway at all. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me yet. This isn't finished. Man like Holloway doesn't back down after one bad evening at a church social. Whatever he's building, we've only seen the first piece of it. He was right, though. Neither of them knew yet just how right, because 3 days later, a rider would come up the mountain road at a dead gallop, kicking dust into the summer air, carrying news that would tear the fragile peace they'd built wide open. News that had Frank Dell's guilty, apologetic face written all over it, and a debt collector's name attached that neither of them had ever heard before. The rider came up the road just past noon, kicking a wake of dust so wide Ethan saw it from the barn before he ever heard the hoofbeats, and something about the pace. Reckless. Not the pace of a man delivering good news, had him walking out to the yard before the horse had even cleared the tree line. It was Doc Whitfield's boy Sam, 15 years old and red in the face from riding hard the whole 6 miles. Mr. Callahan. Sam nearly fell off the horse getting down. Pa sent me, said you'd want to know quick. Know what, son? Catch your breath and tell it straight. There's a man in town, come in on the morning stage. Says he's a debt collector sent for Miss Whitmore, and he's got Sheriff Briggs with him fixing to serve papers. Clara had come out of the cabin at the sound of the horse drying her hands on her apron, and Ethan watched the color drain clean out of her face. Papers, she said. What kind of papers? Warrant, ma'am, for your arrest on account of the debt. Pa says the man's already talking about taking you into custody till the sum's paid, or a judge sorts it, whichever comes first. Ethan felt something cold and furious settle low in his gut. There is no debt. We said that plain at the social in front of half the county. I know it, sir. Pa knows it too. But this fella's got a paper with a bank seal on it, and Sheriff Briggs says a seal like that he's obliged to act on it whether he believes it or not. Clara's hands had gone still against her apron. How long do we have? Collector said he'd ride up himself by evening if Miss Whitmore didn't come down first. Didn't want to wait on it. Ethan looked at the sun, judged the hours left in the day, and felt the whole shape of Holloway's plan click into place with a clarity that made his blood run hot. Scatter the cattle to keep him occupied. Spread rumors to soften the ground. And now papers with a bank seal timed to hit, while the town's goodwill from the social hadn't yet had time to settle into anything solid enough to stand against a lawman's obligation. Sam, Ethan said, ride back and tell your pa we're coming down. Both of us together before that collector ever sets foot on this road. Yes, sir. The boy wheeled his horse and was gone again, dust rising behind him, and Ethan turned to find Clara already halfway to the barn, saddling Bess herself, with hands that shook only slightly. You don't have to go, he said. I could ride down alone, talk to Briggs, sort this out without you standing in front of a man with a warrant, and let them say I hid from the papers the moment trouble came. No, Ethan. I ran from Millbrook already, one town, deciding who I was before I could speak for myself. I won't run from this one, too. She cinched the saddle-tight jaw set. Besides, if there's a debt collector standing in that town with a bank seal, I intend to look him dead in the eye and ask him which bank. Because I kept every ledger my father ever touched, and I know for a fact there is no institution anywhere that would have issued a note against a debt that was settled in full. That's my girl, Ethan said, before he'd thought about the words, and then stopped short, hearing them land strange and warm in the air between them. Clara looked at him, something flickering behind her eyes that wasn't quite a smile, but was close enough to one that it made his chest tighten. We'll discuss that phrase later, Mr. Callahan. Right now, we've got a town to ride into. They found Larkspur already buzzing. When they arrived, the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office crowded with more bodies than Ethan had seen gathered there since the last cattle auction. And at the center of it stood a man Ethan had never laid eyes on. Tall, narrow-faced, dressed sharp in a city coat that had no business on a mountain road, holding a folded document like it was a weapon he was eager to use. "That's him," Clara murmured. "The collector." Sheriff Briggs spotted them first, pushing through the crowd with the tired, apologetic look of a man caught between duty and doubt. "Ethan, Miss Whitmore, this is Mr. Amos Fenwick, come representing First Colorado Trust out of Denver. Says there's an outstanding note against Miss Whitmore's late father's estate." "There is no note," Clara said, sliding down off Bess without waiting for help. "Because I settled every debt my father held before I ever left Millbrook. I kept the ledgers myself, Sheriff. I can produce the receipts." Fenwick's smile was thin, professional, entirely unbothered. "Receipts from over a year past don't account for interest accrued, miss, nor for the transfer of secondary notes your father co-signed for a business partner. The seal on this document is legitimate. I'd be happy to have the sheriff verify it himself." "Then verify it," Ethan said, stepping up beside Clara, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. "Because I don't believe for 1 second there's a bank in Denver that sent a man 6 days' travel over a $200 note without so much as a letter of introduction first." "I have my letter of introduction right here, sir." Fenwick produced a second paper, holding it out for the sheriff, rather than Ethan, a small but deliberate slight. "Signed by the bank's regional officer." Briggs took the paper, studied it, and Ethan watched the sheriff's brow furrow, the way a man's brow furrows when something looks right on its face but sits wrong in his gut. "Seal looks proper," Briggs admitted slow. "I'll wire Denver to confirm it, but that'll take 2-3 days minimum, maybe longer if the lines are busy. And in the meantime," Clara's voice had gone tight-controlled. "In the meantime," Fenwick said, "the law requires the debtor remain within reach of the court, either through surety bond or through custody. I understand that's an unpleasant word, miss, but it's the law all the same." "She's not going into any cell," Ethan said flat final. "Then perhaps you'd care to post the bond yourself, Mr. Callahan. $200 would satisfy the requirement until Denver confirms the note." It was said smooth, almost helpful, and it took Ethan exactly 1 second to understand the trap laid inside it. Because $200 paid in a hurry under pressure with no note to actually verify would be as good as an admission. The debt existed at all. And once he'd paid it once, Holloway would have exactly the leverage he'd been chasing for 2 years, a debt Ethan himself had validated with cash in hand. "I'm not paying a debt that doesn't exist," Ethan said. "But I'll stand surety for Miss Whitmore myself on my word and my land, until that wire comes back from Denver." "That's generous, Mr. Callahan, but the law requires financial surety, not verbal assurance." "Then take my land as bond. 80 acres clear title worth 10 times what you're asking." A murmur went through the crowd, at that the whole town knew exactly which 80 acres Ethan meant, the same ground Holloway had been circling for 2 years, and Fenwick's composure slipped just barely, just long enough for Ethan to see something calculating pass behind his eyes. "I'm not authorized to accept land as surety, Mr. Callahan. Cash only per the bank's instruction." "Funny how specific that instruction is," Ethan said, "for a bank that supposedly doesn't know me from Adam." Before Fenwick could answer, a new voice cut through the crowd, young, unsteady, but rising with a determination that made every head turn. "He's lying." Frank Dell pushed his way to the front of the crowd, pale, sweating, his hands trembling at his sides, and Ethan felt the whole street go still around them. "Frank!" Fenwick said, sharp warning. "No!" Frank's voice cracked but didn't stop. "No, I can't do this anymore. There is no debt, Sheriff. I know because I wrote the letter that brought Miss Whitmore here in the first place on Mr. Holloway's instruction, copying Mr. Callahan's hand off an old land deed in the office files. And I heard Mr. Holloway talking to this man 3 nights back, planning this very thing, timing the papers to come, while the town's still soft on Miss Whitmore, so nobody'd think too hard before they let a lawman haul her off." The crowd erupted into noise, A dozen conversations breaking out at once, and Sheriff Briggs held up both hands, shouting for quiet that took a long moment to come. "Frank Dell," Briggs said once the noise had settled. "You're telling me in front of this whole street that you forged a letter in Ethan Callahan's name on Marsh Holloway's instruction?" "Yes, sir." "And you know this collector's warrant to be false?" Frank looked at Fenwick, then at Clara, and something in his young face crumbled entirely. "I don't know the details of the warrant, but I know there was never any real debt. I heard Mr. Holloway say it himself, said all he needed was a reason to get Miss Whitmore off this mountain long enough to make Mr. Callahan desperate enough to sell, or a reason to get her locked up so nobody'd trust her word against Mr. Holloway's when the real trouble started." "What real trouble?" Ethan said, low dangerous. Frank's eyes dropped to the ground. "The water rights, sir. Not just the 80 acres. Mr. Holloway's been buying up land options all along the ridgeline for near a year, quiet-like through 3 different names, so nobody'd notice the pattern. Your parcel's the only piece he doesn't own or control. Without it, the whole ridge is worthless to him for what he's planning. With it, he controls every drop of water running down this mountain." Ethan finished the pieces slotting together with a cold, sick clarity, "which means every ranch below the ridgeline pays him for access forever." "Yes, sir." The street had gone utterly silent, now the crowd absorbing the shape of a scheme that touched every family within a day's ride. And Ethan watched something shift in the faces around him, the wary, gossiping distance Larkspur had held toward Clara, and toward him, softening into something closer to alarm, closer to recognition, that whatever they'd thought this was about, it had never been about a mail-order bride at all. Fenwick, to his credit, kept his composure even as the ground shifted beneath him. "This is all very dramatic, but a young man's guilty conscience doesn't invalidate a legitimate banknote, Sheriff. I'd ask you to proceed according to the law." "The law," Briggs said slowly, "requires me to wire Denver and confirm this note before I take anybody into custody on it, and given what I just heard, I believe I'll be sending a second wire alongside it, asking some pointed questions about who exactly requested. First Colorado Trust, get involved in a $200 note on a woman with no prior business in this county." "You have no grounds to delay lawful process, Sheriff?" "I have every grounds, Mr. Fenwick, on account of I'm the law here, and you're a stranger with a paper I haven't finished verifying." Briggs's voice had hardened considerably. "Miss Whitmore stays free under Mr. Callahan's surety, verbal or otherwise, until that wire comes back. You want to argue that in front of a judge, you're welcome to wait around for circuit court same as everybody else." Fenwick's jaw tightened, and for just a moment, Ethan saw the practiced smoothness crack entirely, revealing something colder and more frustrated underneath. Then it was gone, tucked back behind professional courtesy, and the collector folded his papers away with exaggerated care. "Very well, Sheriff. I'll wire my employers and advise them of the delay. I do hope for everyone's sake that this matter resolves quickly." He walked off towards the hotel, and the crowd's attention turned immediately to Frank Dell, who stood in the middle of the street, looking like a man who'd just set fire to his own life and wasn't entirely sure he regretted it. "Frank," Doc Whitfield said, stepping forward, "you understand what you've just admitted to in front of this whole town? Forging a document is a serious offense." "I know it, Doc." Frank's voice was steadier now, the worst of the trembling past. "I've known it every day since I wrote that letter. I told myself it was just a job, just following instructions, but I watched Miss Whitmore walk 6 miles up that mountain on a lie I helped write, and I watched Mr. Callahan stand in this street today trying to protect her from a debt I know for a fact doesn't exist, and I couldn't carry it anymore. Whatever happens to me on account of it, I'd rather carry that than carry the other thing." Clara stepped forward before anyone else could speak, and something in her face had softened toward the young clerk in a way that surprised even Ethan. "Mr. Dell, you did a hard thing today, admitting that, in front of your employer and this whole street. I won't pretend it undoes what was done, but it took courage, and I don't forget courage when I see it." Frank looked at her, something like tears standing in his eyes, that he was fighting hard not to let fall in front of a crowd. "I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore, truly. You didn't deserve any of what I helped do to you." "No," Clara agreed. "I didn't. But you've done what you can to set it right, and that matters more than most men manage once they've started down a wrong road. They didn't get more than a quarter-mile out of town before Marsh Holloway's carriage came around the bend fast enough to kick gravel, and Ethan reined up hard, positioning himself instinctively between the carriage and Clara, before it had even come to a full stop. Holloway climbed down without his usual unhurried grace, his face tight with a fury. He wasn't bothering to hide anymore, the smooth banker's mask stripped clean away. "You've made a serious mistake today, Callahan. Seems to me Frank Dell made the mistake standing up in the middle of Main Street and telling the whole county exactly what you've been building toward." Frank Dell is a frightened boy who doesn't understand half of what he thinks he overheard. He understood plenty. Enough that Sheriff Briggs is wiring Denver tonight, and enough that half the ranches below that ridge line are going to start asking real hard questions about every land option you've bought up quiet this past year. Ethan's voice had gone low level, the particular calm of a man who'd stopped being afraid of the fight, because he'd already decided he was going to win it. "You wanted this parcel bad enough to forge a letter, scatter my cattle, and send a false collector after an innocent woman. That's not a man playing within the rules anymore, Marsh. That's a man who's about to lose everything he's spent years building, and everybody in that street back there just watched it start unraveling." Holloway's face had gone a mottled red, and for one long moment, Ethan thought the man might actually swing at him. The fury was that raw, that close to the surface, but Holloway caught himself visibly forcing the mask back into place through sheer will. "You think this ends today? You think one confession from a clerk and one delayed wire changes anything?" He looked past Ethan to Clara, and something ugly moved behind his eyes. "You should have taken the stage fare back east when I offered it, Miss Whitmore. Would have spared yourself a great deal of trouble." "I don't run from trouble, Mr. Holloway." Clara said, her voice steady, despite the cold fury Ethan could feel radiating off her. "I've noticed that seems to unsettle you a great deal more than it should. You'll regret that attitude before this is finished. I regret nothing so far, except not seeing your scheme sooner," Clara shot back. "Though I suppose I should thank you in a strange way. If you hadn't forged that letter, I'd never have found this mountain or this ranch or the people willing to stand beside me instead of behind me." Holloway's eyes narrowed, and he turned back to Ethan with the particular venom of a man who'd just realized his leverage was crumbling faster than he could rebuild it. "The east parcel isn't the only piece of ground I've got interest in, Callahan. You'd do well to remember that a man in my position has more ways to apply pressure than one clerk's guilty conscience can undo." "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact. Enjoy your evening." Holloway climbed back into his carriage, and it pulled away hard faster than it had come, leaving a settling cloud of dust and a silence between Ethan and Clara that neither of them rushed to break. "He's not finished," Clara said finally. "No, he's not. But he's scared now, and a scared man makes mistakes faster than a patient one does." Ethan turned to look at her, something steady and certain in his face, despite the tension still coiled tight in his shoulders. "We just need to be ready when he makes the next one." Crad. The next one came faster than either of them expected, and it came in the dead of night 3 days later, in the form of orange light against the dark sky, where the eastern fence line met the tree line light that meant fire, and fire in dry summer grass meant a man's whole herd, and half his grazing land could be gone before morning. Ethan was up and moving before Clara's shout from the porch had fully registered, running for the barn, throwing tack onto the nearest horse, with hands that moved faster than his thoughts, and Clara was right behind him, already pulling on boots, already reaching for the second saddle. "You're not coming," he said, not even looking at her, already swinging up onto the horse. "Like hell I'm not." She was up on Bess before he could argue further, and there wasn't time to argue anyway, because the orange glow on the ridge was spreading faster than any grass fire ought to spread on a night without lightning or a struck match from careless hands. "That's set deliberate, Ethan. You know it same as I do." He did know it. He'd known it the second he saw the light, because that fire had started right along the boundary line Silas Cutter had ridden the survey on weeks back, right along the fence he'd found cut and mended twice since, and there was no lightning in a clear summer sky, and no careless hand that started a fire in 3 places at once, which was exactly what he could see now. As they crested the ridge, 3 separate lines of flame, spaced too evenly to be anything but planned. "Get the shovels and the wet sacks from the barn," Ethan shouted, already dismounting, already moving toward the nearest line of flame with the particular controlled urgency of a man who'd fought range fires before and knew exactly how fast panic could turn a manageable blaze into a catastrophe. "Beat it at the edges. Don't let it jump the fire break." Clara was back within minutes, soaked sacks in hand, and the 2 of them worked side by side in the smoke and heat and roaring orange light, beating flames back from the fence line, while cattle screamed and scattered in the pasture beyond, and it was brutal, exhausting. Terrifying work that left Ethan's lungs burning and his hands blistered before the first line of fire finally guttered down to smoldering black. "2 more!" Clara shouted, pointing, and they ran for the second line, and Ethan lost track of time entirely in the grinding, desperate rhythm of it. Beat, smother, move, until finally, near dawn, the last ember died under his boot heel, and he collapsed onto the scorched ground, chest, heaving, hands raw, watching the gray light of morning creep over a pasture half blackened, but not lost, not entirely. Clara collapsed beside him. Coughing soot streaked across her face, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, just breathed, just existed in the aftermath of a night that had nearly taken everything. "We saved it," she said finally. Disbelief and exhaustion tangled together in her voice. "Most of it." Ethan looked out over the blackened stretch of pasture, the fence line scorched but still standing, and felt a fury settle into his chest that was colder and more dangerous than the panic that had driven him out of bed. "He tried to burn me out, actually tried to burn me out rather than lose this parcel. We need proof," Clara said. "Real proof, something a judge would have to believe, not just Frank Dell's word against Holloway's, because Holloway will simply say the fire was an accident, dry grass, and bad luck. 3 fires in 3 places isn't bad luck. No. But we need someone who saw him set it or paid to have it set, or we need something with his name on it that ties him to this land scheme plain enough that no judge in the territory could wave it off." Clara pushed herself upright, wincing at the ache in her arms, and looked at Ethan with a fierce, exhausted determination that he was coming to recognize as simply who she was underneath everything else. "Frank Dell said Holloway's been buying land options through 3 different names. If we can find those names, find the paper trail connecting them back to Holloway himself." "The land office," Ethan said, understanding dawning. "Every option, every deed, every transfer's got to be filed there. If Holloway's been careful, the filings won't say his name outright. But somebody had to sign for him. Somebody had to notarize it." "Frank Dell," Clara said. "Frank Dell." Ethan agreed, already pushing himself to his feet, despite the exhaustion dragging at every muscle. "If he's willing to keep telling the truth, and if he kept any record at all of what he filed and for who, then we'd have exactly what a judge would need to see this for what it is." Clara stood to, swaying slightly with fatigue, and Ethan reached out without thinking to steady her, his blistered hand closing around her arm, and for a moment neither of them moved. Standing in the gray dawn light, amid the ruin of a fire that had nearly taken everything closer to each other than they'd ever quite let themselves be. "You could have been killed tonight," Ethan said quietly, "fighting a fire that was never your fight to begin with. It became my fight the moment I walked up your road, Ethan. I don't regret that, whatever it costs." She looked up at him, soot and exhaustion and something else entirely written plain across her face. "I told you before, I'm not the kind of woman who stands aside while people she cares for get robbed of what's theirs." The word hung in the air between them. Cares for, and Ethan felt it land somewhere deep in his chest, cracking something open that had been sealed tight for 6 long years. "Clara, don't," she said softly, not unkindly. "Not now. Not with the whole pasture still smoking and Holloway still out there planning whatever comes next. Say it when we've won, Ethan. Say it when I don't have to wonder if you mean it, or if it's just the fire talking, the fear talking. Two people who nearly died together saying things they might not mean once the danger's passed. He looked at her for a long moment, understanding the wisdom in what she was asking. Even as some raw, unguarded part of him wanted to say it anyway, right there in the ash and the smoke. "All right," he said finally. "When we've won. I'll say it then, and you'll know for certain it's true, because I'll have had time enough to be sure of my own heart before I hand it to you." Something in her face softened entirely at that, and for just a moment, standing in the wreckage of Holloway's cruelest move, yet it felt less like the darkest morning of the whole ordeal, and more like the first real promise either of them had dared to make. They rode to the land office that same afternoon, exhausted soot still under their fingernails, and found Frank Dell already there, hunched over the filing cabinets, with an urgency that told them he'd heard about the fire before they'd even arrived. "I heard," he said before either of them could speak. "The whole town's heard. I've been pulling every filing I can find since sunup." He turned, and in his hands he held a thin stack of papers, his face pale but resolute in a way that hadn't been there 3 days back in the street. "I kept copies," he said. "Not because I planned to use them against him. I've always kept copies of everything I file force of habit from my old clerking job back east. Every option Holloway had me file went through 3 names. Cutter, a man named Aldous Pratt out of Denver, and a widow named Mrs. Iris Colton, who I don't believe exists at all because I've never once seen a signature from her that didn't match Mr. Holloway's own hand, just slanted different to disguise it." Clara took the papers with hands that trembled slightly, scanning them fast, her eyes narrowing with the particular focus Ethan had watched her bring to every ledger she'd touched since she arrived. "This is everything," she said, disbelief coloring her voice. "Every option. Every filing, all leading back to accounts he controls. Frank, this is exactly what we need." "I know it," Frank said. "I should have come forward with it sooner. I was scared of what he'd do, what it'd cost me. But after last night, after I heard about the fire..." His voice caught. "Somebody could have died. I couldn't keep protecting a man willing to burn a family's land rather than lose a business deal." Ethan clapped a hand on the young man's shoulder, firm, grateful. "You're doing right by it now, son. That's what matters." "There's one more thing," Frank said, and something in his tone made both Ethan and Clara go still. "Holloway's leaving. Tonight on the late stage, headed for Denver. I heard him telling Cutter this morning, said if the fire didn't finish the job, he wasn't sticking around to watch a circuit judge pick apart 2 years of careful work. Said he'd rather cut his losses and start fresh somewhere. The name Holloway didn't carry so much trouble attached to it." "He's running," Clara said. "With every dollar he's pulled together from those land options," Frank confirmed. "If he gets on that stage tonight, Miss Whitmore, I don't believe anybody in this territory ever sees a cent of justice out of this. He'll just start the same scheme somewhere else, against some other family who doesn't have the good fortune of a clerk with a guilty conscience." Ethan looked at the papers in Clara's hands, looked at the sun already beginning its slow slide toward evening, and felt the whole shape of the fight sharpened down to a single narrow window of time. "What time's the late stage?" 7 o'clock, sir. Less than 3 hours from now." "Then we've got less than 3 hours to get Sheriff Briggs these papers and enough proof in front of a circuit judge or whoever we can find with the authority to stop that stage before Marsh Holloway disappears with everything he stole, and every family below that ridgeline pays the price for it for years to come." Clara was already folding the papers carefully into her bag, her jaw set with the same fierce determination Ethan had watched carry her 6 miles up a mountain road on a split boot. "Then we'd best ride fast," she said, "because I did not walk into this fight, watch a fire nearly take everything, and stand in that street facing down a false collector only to let that man climb onto a stage tonight and vanish scot-free." They rode for town at a dead gallop, the papers that could finally unmask Marsh Holloway clutched tight in Clara's bag, the sun sliding lower with every stride, and neither one of them said aloud what they were both thinking. That if they didn't reach Sheriff Briggs before that 7 o'clock stage pulled out of Larkspur, everything they'd fought for, everything they'd nearly died for in the smoke and flame of the night before, would ride off down that mountain road and never be seen again. Sheriff Briggs was locking up the office for the evening when Ethan and Clara came thundering down Main Street hard enough that half the town turned to watch, and he had the door half shut behind him when Ethan swung down off his horse before the animal had fully stopped moving. "Sheriff, we need you now." "Ethan, I was just fixing to head home for supper." Holloway's catching the 7 o'clock stage out of town with every dollar he's stolen from that land scheme, and we've got the paper trail to prove it, but it's sitting in Clara's bag, and it won't do a lick of good if he's halfway to Denver before you've read the first page. That got Briggs's full attention. He pushed the office door back open. "Inside, both of you. Now." Clara laid the papers out across the sheriff's desk, with hands that had steadied considerably since the ride into town, ordering them the way she ordered every ledger she'd ever touched by name, by date, by the pattern only a careful eye could see underneath the surface of it. 3 names, she said. Silas Cutter Aldous Pratt and a widow named Iris Colton who Frank Dell says doesn't exist. Every option filed under those 3 names traces back to accounts controlled by Marsh Holloway. Look at the dates, Sheriff. Every single filing came within days of Holloway making an offer on a neighboring parcel under his own name and being refused. He couldn't buy the land outright without raising suspicion about how much he was accumulating, so he built a wall of false names around it instead. Briggs read fast, his face darkening with every page, and when he reached the filing for the 80 acres bordering Ethan's own fence line, the same parcel Holloway had been pressuring him to sell for 2 years, the sheriff let out a low, disgusted breath. "He's been planning this for over a year." "Longer," Clara said. "Frank believes closer to 2. And Frank Dell notarized these himself. Under instruction, yes. He's willing to testify to it. He already stood up in the middle of Main Street 3 days back and told the whole town he forged the letter that brought me here. A man who does that once isn't likely to go quiet now." Briggs set the papers down, rubbed a hand across his jaw, and looked up at the clock on the office wall. 6:15. "This is enough to hold him," Briggs said slowly. "Enough to arrest him on suspicion of fraud and hold him till the circuit judge comes through next month to sort the rest of it proper. But arresting Marsh Holloway isn't a small thing, Ethan. Man's got money, got a lawyer in Denver on retainer, and he'll fight this every step. Let him fight it from a jail cell instead of from Denver with every dollar he stole already spent," Ethan said. "Sheriff, that stage leaves in 45 minutes. If he gets on it, you know as well as I do, he's not coming back to answer for any of this." Briggs was already reaching for his gun belt, buckling it with the brisk efficiency of a man who'd made his decision. "I'll need a deputy, 2 if I can rustle them up in time." "I'll deputize myself if that's what it takes," Ethan said. "You will not," Briggs said, not unkindly. "You're a witness and a wronged party in this, not a lawman. And the last thing we need is Holloway's expensive Denver counsel arguing the arrest was made improper on account of a rancher with a personal grudge doing the sheriff's job for him. You'll come along, but you'll stand back and let me do the arresting." "Fine," Ethan said, though the word came out tight, impatient. "Just move fast." They found Marsh Holloway at the stage depot with 2 trunks already loaded and a ticket in his gloved hand standing beside Silas Cutter, who was counting out coins to the depot clerk with the particular hurried carelessness of men trying to finish business before anyone noticed they were in a hurry to finish it. "Marsh Holloway." Sheriff Briggs's voice carried clean across the depot yard, and every head within earshot turned. "I'll need you to step away from that stage." Holloway's face went through a fast sequence of expressions. Surprise, calculation, and finally a thin practiced smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Sheriff, I'm afraid I've a stage to catch. Business in Denver. Business can wait. I've got papers here signed under 3 false names, all tracing back to accounts under your control, all filed by a clerk who's already testified in front of half this town that he acted on your direct instruction." Briggs stepped closer, one hand resting easy near his hip. "I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of land fraud forgery and inciting arson against Ethan Callahan's property. Arson." Holloway's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went cold and calculating. "That's a serious accusation, Sheriff, and I'd remind you that accusations without proof tend to embarrass the men who make them." "We've got proof," Clara said, stepping forward, and Holloway's eyes shifted to her with an expression that had shed every last trace of the smooth courtesy he'd worn at the church social. Every filing, every false name, every date lined up neat against every offer you made and got refused. Frank Dell's already told the truth once in front of this whole town, Mr. Holloway. He's not likely to stop now. Frank Dell is a frightened boy telling stories to save his own skin. Frank Dell, said a voice from behind them, and the young clerk himself stepped into the depot yard, pale but steady. Is standing right here, Mr. Holloway, and I've got nothing left to lose by telling the truth. I've already told it once. I'll tell it in front of a judge, same as I told it in front of the whole street. Holloway's jaw tightened, and for one long, dangerous moment, Ethan thought the man might actually bolt for the stage, might try to force his way past Briggs, and gamble on outrunning the law long enough to disappear into Denver's crowded streets. He saw the calculation happening behind Holloway's eyes, saw the man's gaze flick toward the horses tied at the depot rail toward the open road beyond. Don't, Ethan said quietly, stepping forward close enough now that he stood between Holloway and any clear path to a horse. Whatever you're thinking of trying, don't. There's a sheriff here with a legal warrant, half the town watching, and I promise you, Marsh, I will not stand aside and let you run from what you did to Clara, to Frank, to every family below that ridgeline you've been quietly robbing for 2 years. You'd stop me yourself, would you? Callahan assault a man in front of witnesses, ruin your own standing right alongside mine. I wouldn't need to lay a hand on you. Ethan's voice had gone low hard. I'd just need to stand here and watch the sheriff do his job same as I'm doing right now. Holloway looked around the depot yard at Briggs's steady hand near his gun, at Frank Dell's resolute young face, at Clara, standing with her chin lifted, and her eyes unflinching at the small crowd that had gathered to watch, drawn by the same instinct that draws any small town to a spectacle unfolding in its own streets. And something in him seemed to deflate the fight going out of him all at once. This is absurd, he said, but the words had lost their conviction. I'll have this sorted within the week. My lawyer in Denver. Your lawyer in Denver can meet you at the circuit court when it comes through, Briggs said, already producing a set of manacles from his belt. Marsh Holloway, you're under arrest. Silas Cutter, you're coming along too on account of trespass and cattle tampering, unless you'd care to tell me right now who cut Ethan Callahan's fence line and drove his herd toward that ridge. Cutter, given the sudden and unwelcome spotlight, folded faster than Ethan expected. It was him. Holloway ordered it. Said it'd keep Callahan too busy to think straight while the collector business played out. Cutter, you fool. Holloway started, but the damage was already done. The young man's nerve breaking exactly the way Frank Dell's had broken 3 days back in the street, and Ethan felt something in his chest loosen at the sight of it, the whole rotten structure of Holloway's scheme finally collapsing under its own weight, one frightened man at a time. And the fires, Ethan said. 3 lines set at once along my east fence 2 nights back. You'll want to ask him about that too, Sheriff. Cutter's face went white. I didn't have nothing to do with the fires. That wasn't me. Then who? Briggs asked sharp. Cutter's eyes darted to Holloway, and whatever loyalty had kept him quiet through the rest of it finally broke entirely. He hired 2 men out of Denver for that. Paid them separate from the rest, told me himself he wanted it to look like bad luck dry grass catching from nothing at all. Said if the fire took the whole east pasture, Callahan would be desperate enough to sell, rather than lose everything trying to rebuild. The crowd's murmur turned into something sharper, angrier, and Ethan watched the last of Larkspur's lingering doubt about Clara, about the strange circumstances that had brought her up the mountain burn away entirely in the face of what Holloway had actually been willing to do. You tried to burn a man's land, Doc Whitfield said, stepping forward from the crowd, his voice thick with disgust. Land where his wife and daughter are buried, Marsh. I've known you 15 years. I didn't think you'd sunk that low. You don't understand what's at stake, Holloway said, and for the first time his composure cracked entirely, revealing something raw and ugly underneath. That water access is worth more than any of you can imagine. Every ranch on this mountain would have paid me for it for years, for generations. I built something real? Something that would have outlasted every one of you, and one stubborn rancher's sentiment over a fence line nearly cost me all of it. Sentiment, Ethan repeated, quiet dangerous. That ground holds my wife and my daughter Marsh. You call that sentiment. I call it the last thing I've got left of them, and you were willing to burn it to nothing rather than accept the word no. Holloway had no answer for that, and Briggs finished closing the manacles around his wrists without further resistance, the fight entirely gone out of the man. Now that the whole town stood witness to exactly what he'd been willing to do. Get him to the jail, Briggs said to his deputy. Cutter, too. We'll sort the particulars once Denver confirms the account records, but I don't imagine there's much doubt left standing in this yard about what happened here. The 7 o'clock stage left without Marsh Holloway aboard it, and the depot yard slowly emptied of its crowd. The spectacle finished, though the talk of it would carry through Larkspur for months, maybe years, the way talk of a genuine scandal always did in a town too small to have much else to discuss. Clara stood in the settling dust, the papers that had unmasked Holloway still clutched in her hands, and Ethan watched something in her posture finally ease the tight, braced readiness she'd carried since the moment she collapsed at his gate, loosening at last, now that the danger had a name and a jail cell attached to it. It's over, she said, disbelief threading through her voice. Most of it, Ethan said. There'll be a circuit judge to answer to yet, and Denver to confirm the accounts and Frank's own part in the forgery to sort through fair whatever mercy the court sees fit to show him for coming forward. But the worst of it, yes. It's over. Frank Dell stood a little apart from them, uncertain, and Clara turned to him with a warmth that seemed to catch the young man entirely off guard. You saved us today, Frank. Twice over if I'm counting right, once in the street, once just now. I helped cause the trouble in the first place, Miss Whitmore. I don't reckon that evens out. No, Clara agreed gently. It doesn't erase it. But a man who tells the truth even when it costs him dear is worth 10 who never had the courage to lie in the first place. Whatever the judge decides about your part in this, I intend to speak on your behalf when the time comes. Frank's throat worked, and he had to look away for a moment, blinking hard. That's more kindness than I've earned, ma'am. Maybe, Ethan said. Or maybe it's exactly the kindness a man earns when he finally does right, even scared, even late. Either way, Frank, you'll find both of us standing beside you when that judge comes through, same as we stood against Holloway today. The days that followed moved with a strange, unfamiliar ease. Neither Ethan nor Clara had quite gotten used to no rider appearing at the tree line with bad intentions. No cut wire, no scattered cattle, no letters with someone else's forged hand behind them. Just the ordinary rhythm of ranch work, mended fence and morning chores, and the particular quiet satisfaction of two people building something together, without a shadow hanging over every hour of it. Word came up the mountain 10 days later, carried by Sam Whitfield on his father's fastest horse, that Denver had confirmed everything. The false accounts, the 3 names, the total sum of Holloway's fraud, running well past $6,000, stolen in careful pieces from families who'd never known to look for the pattern until Clara's ledger eye had traced it plain. Judge is coming through in 3 weeks, Sam reported, breathless as ever from the ride. Circuit court setting up in the church hall on account of it being the only room big enough for how many folks want to watch. Sheriff says Holloway's lawyer already tried to get the whole thing moved to Denver. Said his client couldn't get a fair hearing in a town he'd nearly burned down, but the judge refused it flat. Said if the crime happened in Larkspur, justice would happen in Larkspur too. And Cutter? Ethan asked. Turning state's evidence, they're saying on account of he wasn't the one who ordered the fires, just the one dumb enough to go along with everything else. Sam grinned, young and delighted by the drama of it all, in the particular way boys of 15 delighted in scandal that didn't touch them directly. Whole county's talking about nothing else, Mr. Callahan. Some folks are saying Miss Whitmore ought to get a medal for catching him. Clara, who'd come out onto the porch to hear the news, laughed for the first time in longer than Ethan could remember hearing from her. A real laugh, unguarded, surprised out of her by the boy's earnestness. I don't need a medal, Sam. I just need the man to face what he did plain and public, so nobody in this county ever forgets what he was willing to do to keep it hidden." "Well, he's going to get exactly that," Sam said. "Whole town's fixing to be there." The 3 weeks between Sam's news and the circuit judge's arrival passed in a strange, suspended kind of peace, and it was during those weeks that Ethan finally told Clara the rest of what he'd only half shared that first night on the porch. The whole shape of the grief he'd carried alone for 6 years, laid out plain in the evening quiet while they sat together on the same porch step where she'd first joined him under the moonlight. "Her name was Sarah," he said. "My wife, and our daughter was Grace. Named her that on account of she came into the world easy after a labor everybody expected to be hard. Sarah used to say it felt like a blessing having a child who arrived gentle when the whole world seemed set on being anything but." Clara didn't say anything, didn't reach for him, just sat close enough that her shoulder brushed his offering, the same silent presence she'd offered that very first night. Fever came through in the fall of '80. Took half the children in the county, and it took Grace inside 3 days, and Sarah wasn't but a week behind, her worn thin from nursing our daughter and catching the same sickness for her trouble. Ethan's voice had gone rough low, the words coming slower now, harder won. "I buried them both under that cottonwood on the east parcel because it was the only shade on the whole ranch, and Sarah always said she liked to sit under it in summer. Told myself I'd build the fence around it so nothing would ever disturb that ground, and then I just stopped. Stopped talking much. Stopped expecting anybody'd stay long enough to be worth talking to." "And then a stranger fell at your gate," Clara said softly. "And then a stranger fell at my gate," he agreed, and near broke 15 years of silence just by being too stubborn to accept a hand up off the ground. Clara turned to look at him, fully gray eyes steady in the fading evening light. "I'm not trying to replace them, Ethan. I want you to know that. Whatever this is, whatever's grown between us these past weeks, I'd never ask you to set aside what you lost to make room for me. I know that," he said. "You've never once asked me to be anything but exactly what I am, grief and silence and all of it. That's a rarer thing than you might know, Clara. Most folks either pity a man for his losses or expect him to be done grieving on their timeline instead of his own. You've never done either. I know a little something about grief that doesn't keep to anybody's timeline," she said. "My mother died slow over 2 years, and I nursed her through every one of those months alone, because my father was already gone and there wasn't anybody else. I don't imagine I'll ever be finished missing her, not truly. I've just learned to carry it different than I did at first. Learned it doesn't have to be the only thing I'm carrying." Ethan reached over slow, giving her every chance to pull away if she wanted to, and closed his hand gently over hers, where it rested on the porch step between them. She didn't pull away. She turned her hand over instead, fingers lacing through his, and they sat like that a long while, saying nothing further. The silence between them entirely different now than the silence Ethan had carried alone for 15 years. "I told you I'd say it when we'd won," he said finally. Quiet, the words coming easier than he expected. "Judge hasn't come through yet. Holloway's still sitting in that cell waiting on his day of reckoning. I don't know that we've won, not entirely, not yet." "Close enough," Clara said. "Close enough that I don't intend to let you wait on a technicality, Ethan Callahan." He looked at her, something breaking open in his chest that had been sealed shut since the fever took Sarah and Grace 6 long years back. And he said the words plain, without hesitation, the way he'd promised her he would once he was certain. "I love you, Clara Whitmore. Started somewhere around watching you fix a fence rail you had no obligation to fix, and it's only grown steadier every single day since straight through fire and false collectors and everything Holloway threw at us trying to tear it apart before it had the chance to take root." Clara's eyes had gone bright, and she didn't try to hide it, didn't try to be anything but exactly as moved as she was. "I love you too, Ethan. I think I knew it the night we saved those 2 strays from going over the ridge, watching you talk that frightened animal back from the edge soft as anything, and thinking to myself that a man who handled fear that gentle couldn't possibly be the cold, unreachable rancher the whole town made him out to be." He kissed her, Then slow and certain 6 years of carefully guarded silence, finally giving way to something neither of them had expected to find on a mountain road in the summer of 1886. And somewhere down in the valley below, Marsh Holloway sat in a jail cell, counting down the days until a circuit judge would strip away everything he'd built on lies and cruelty while up on the mountain. Two people who'd been broken by very different griefs finally found something whole to build instead. The circuit judge arrived on a hot morning 3 weeks later, and the church hall filled past capacity long before the proceedings began. Every family from Larkspur and the ranches below the ridgeline crowding in to witness the reckoning they'd all been waiting on. Clara sat in the front row beside Ethan, her ledgers and her careful records spread on the table before her, ready to testify to every figure, every falsified name, every piece of the scheme she'd helped unravel. Marsh Holloway sat across the aisle in irons, his lawyer from Denver beside him, looking increasingly grim as witness after witness took the stand. Frank Dell steady, now telling the full truth without flinching. Silas Cutter, eager to shift blame in exchange for leniency. Doc Whitfield, testifying to the letter's forged hand. And finally, Clara herself, walking the judge through the entire paper trail with the same clear, methodical precision she'd brought to every ledger she'd ever balanced. "And you're certain," the judge asked her, "that these 3 names all trace to accounts controlled by the defendant?" "I'm certain, Your Honor. I kept my father's books for 11 years before I ever came west. I know the shape of a false pattern when I see one, and this pattern is about as false as they come. 3 names, 1 hand behind all of them, every filing timed to a refused offer under Mr. Holloway's own name." The judge studied her a long moment, something like respect settling into his weathered face. "Well testified, Miss Whitmore. I don't believe I've had a witness lay out a fraud case this cleanly in some years of riding this circuit." The verdict, when it came 2 days later, was as thorough as the evidence had demanded restitution to every family Holloway had defrauded forfeiture of the false-named land options back to their rightful owners, and a sentence that would keep Marsh Holloway well away from Larkspur County for a good many years to come. Cutter, for his cooperation, received a lighter sentence and a stern warning never to set foot on Callahan land again. Frank Dell, for his forgery and his eventual courage in exposing it, was given a suspended sentence and a debt of community service that Doc Whitfield himself offered to oversee, muttering something about a clerk with a good heart and bad judgment, deserving a second chance to prove which one won out in the end. When it was finally truly over, the judge's gavel fallen, the courtroom emptying into the bright summer afternoon, Holloway led away in irons, toward a wagon that would carry him to territorial prison. Ethan and Clara walked out of the church hall together into the sunlight, and for the first time since a wounded, exhausted stranger had collapsed at his gate, Ethan Callahan felt entirely, completely free of the weight he'd carried for so many years. He'd nearly forgotten what it was like to walk without it. "It's really over," Clara said, echoing her words from the depot yard, but with a different, deeper certainty behind them now. "It's really over," Ethan agreed, and took her hand in the open street in front of the whole town, not caring one bit who saw it or what they might say. "Come on, Clara Whitmore, let's go home." The ride home from the church hall took longer than it needed to, both of them content to let the horses walk instead of run for the first time in weeks, and neither of them said much, because after everything, the silence between them had finally become the good kind again, the kind that didn't need filling. It was Clara who broke it, somewhere past the second creek, crossing the same crossing where her boot had split that first desperate day. "I keep thinking about that letter," she said. "The forged one. If Frank had never written it, if Holloway had never set his scheme in motion at all, I'd still be in Millbrook right now, keeping books nobody trusted a woman to keep wondering what I'd done wrong to deserve a town that judged me before I'd said a word." "And I'd still be up on that mountain," Ethan said. "Not shaking hands, not speaking more than I had to, telling myself I'd made my peace with being alone. Strange, isn't it? The worst thing that ever happened to either of us turned out to be the very thing that brought us together." "Not strange," Ethan said. "Just proof that good can come walking up out of bad, so long as somebody's got the stubbornness to see it through." He glanced over at her, something warm and unguarded in his face, that she'd only started seeing regularly these past weeks. "You've got more stubbornness in you than any person I've ever met, Clara Whitmore, and I mean that as the finest compliment I know how to give." High praise from a man who once caught a falling stranger and decided to keep her. Didn't decide anything at first, just caught you because you were falling and it seemed the decent thing to do. He reached over, took her hand loose in his as the horses walked on. Everything after that, though, that I decided plenty deliberate. The ranch when they reached it looked different than it had that first burning afternoon. Clara arrived, the fence mended clean, along every line Holloway's men had once cut the pasture grass, growing back green, over the scorched patches from the fire, the cabin windows thrown open to let the summer evening air move through rooms that no longer held only silence. They fell into a rhythm over the following days that felt almost unbearably ordinary. After everything that had come before, it chores at dawn supper together at the same table, where Clara had once eaten like a woman unsure a second meal was coming, evenings on the porch step, that had become without either of them quite naming it their place. Word of the trial's outcome spread through the county, fast, and with it came a shift in how Larkspur looked at the Callahan ranch. Neighbors who'd never once ridden up that mountain road started finding reasons to visit. A borrowed tool returned with an extra jar of preserves, tucked in a friendly wave, where there'd only ever been wary distance before an invitation to the next social that came addressed this time to both of them by name. Ruth Ann Colby herself showed up on the fourth day, standing awkward at the fence line, with a basket of biscuits she clearly hadn't planned on delivering personally. "Mrs. Colby," Clara said, surprised, wiping flour from her own hands where she'd been working the kitchen. "I owe you an apology, Miss Whitmore." Ruth Ann's chin was up, but there was something genuine underneath the stiffness, the particular discomfort of a proud woman forcing herself through words she didn't enjoy saying. "I said unkind things to you at that social and unkinder things about you before I'd ever met you at all. I was wrong. You've done more good for this county in a season than half the families who've lived here their whole lives, and I should have had the sense to see that instead of assuming the worst on account of a rumor." Clara studied her a long moment, then took the basket with a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Colby. That took some courage to say. Less courage than you showed standing up to Marsh Holloway in front of the whole town." Ruth Ann said, some of her old sharpness returning, though gentler now. "I don't suppose you'd consider mending my Sunday dress before next week's service. I heard you've a fine hand with a needle, and mine's gone clumsy since my eyes started troubling me." "I'd be glad to," Clara said, and meant it, and watched something ease in Ruth Ann's face that told her the apology had cost the woman more than the biscuits ever could. It was Frank Dell who brought the first real trouble back to their door, riding up 9 days after the verdict with a letter clutched in his hand and worry written plain across his young face. "Mr. Callahan, Miss Whitmore." He dismounted, fast, breathless. "This came for the land office today, addressed to whoever's handling the disposition of the Holloway parcels. I opened it on account of Sheriff Briggs asked me to keep processing the paperwork while things get sorted proper, and I think you'd both better read it." Clara took the letter, scanning it fast, and Ethan watched her brow furrow deeper with every line. "What is it?" he said. "It's from Amos Fenwick," Clara said slowly. "The collector. He's claiming he represents a legitimate creditor with a prior lien against the 80-acre parcel. Your parcel Ethan filed, he says, before Holloway's arrest through a firm in Denver that has nothing to do with the false accounts we already exposed. He's saying the restitution ruling didn't account for this separate claim, and unless it's settled, he intends to file suit to force a sale of the parcel to satisfy the debt." "That's a lie," Ethan said flat. "There's no debt on that land. Never has been." "I know it," Clara said. "But, Ethan, this is exactly the same maneuver he tried before a paper with an official seal timed to catch us settled and unprepared, banking on the fact that fighting a Denver firm in court costs more than most ranchers can afford, even ranchers who've already won once. You think Holloway set this in motion before his arrest? A second scheme in case the first one failed. I think Amos Fenwick worked for Holloway a great deal longer than one debt collection. And I think a man like that doesn't simply give up his income just because his employer's sitting in territorial prison. Clara's jaw had set in the way Ethan had come to recognize as her getting ready for a fight. We need to see the actual filing. If it's real, we answer it honest. If it's forged, same as everything else Fenwick's touched, we expose it the same way we expose the rest. I can pull whatever's on record at the land office. Frank offered immediately. If there's a filing, it'll be there. If there isn't, then Fenwick's bluffing. Ethan finished, same as he bluffed that day in the street with a warrant he was hoping nobody would question too hard. They rode into Larkspur together the next morning, and what they found at the land office confirmed exactly what Clara had suspected. No prior lien existed anywhere in the county's recorded filings. No Denver firm had ever registered a claim against the 80 acres. And when Frank wired the firm, Fenwick claimed to represent the reply, came back within the day, denying any knowledge of the matter entirely. He made the whole thing up, Frank said, reading the wire aloud in the sheriff's office, disbelief and anger tangled together in his voice. There's no lien. There's no firm claim. He's just trying the same trick twice, hoping we wouldn't check as careful the second time. Sheriff Briggs folded the wire with the particular grim satisfaction of a lawman watching a criminal make the same mistake twice. Well, he checked wrong. Fraudulent legal filing, attempted extortion. I believe Mr. Fenwick's got himself a warrant coming, same as his former employer. Where is he now? Ethan asked. Staying at the hotel, far as I know, waiting on Ethan or Clara to panic and offer a settlement before the whole thing gets looked at too close. Briggs was already reaching for his hat. Let's go pay the man a visit before he decides to catch an early stage out of town, same as Holloway tried. They found Fenwick in the hotel dining room, finishing a late breakfast with the unbothered ease of a man who believed his scheme was still working, and his composure cracked fast and satisfying the moment Briggs laid the denial wire on the table in front of him. The firm you claim to represent has never heard of you, Mr. Fenwick, nor of any lien against Ethan Callahan's land. Care to explain that? Fenwick's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. There must be some clerical error. There's no error, Clara said, sitting down across from him without being invited. Her voice cool and controlled, in a way that Ethan had learned meant she'd already won the argument before it properly started. You tried this exact trick once before, Mr. Fenwick, with a false debt and a bank seal that turned out to mean nothing once anyone looked close. I imagine you thought enough time had passed, enough trust rebuilt, that nobody would bother checking a second time. You were wrong. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Clara said. I'm stating a fact, same as I stated it the first time you tried to frighten me with paperwork that didn't exist. You worked for Marsh Holloway. When his scheme collapsed, you decided to run one more angle before word of his arrest cost you your usual line of work. It very nearly worked because you're good at what you do, Mr. Fenwick. But you made one mistake. And what mistake is that? You tried it against a woman who reads ledgers for a living, Clara said. In a town that's finally learned to check the truth of a claim before it lets a stranger frighten a family off their own land. Fenwick looked around the table at Briggs's steady, unimpressed expression, at Ethan's arms crossed and jaw set, at Clara's unshakable composure, and seemed to understand all at once exactly how thoroughly he'd been beaten. I'll be gone from this county by morning, he said, quiet, defeated. You'll be gone from this county in irons, Briggs corrected, on account of attempted extortion, unless you'd care to explain yourself to a judge instead. Either way, Mr. Fenwick, your business in Larkspur is finished. That final piece of Holloway's collapsed scheme settled something in Ethan that he hadn't fully realized was still unsettled, a low, persistent wariness he'd carried since that first cut wire. The sense that danger might still be circling somewhere out past the tree line, waiting on its next opening. With Fenwick led away, and the last false claim dissolved to nothing, that wariness finally fully let go. He felt it clearest that evening, standing at the edge of the east parcel, where the cottonwood tree threw long shadows over two simple markers, Clara beside him, the whole mountain quiet and gold, in the last hour of daylight. I haven't brought anybody out here before, he said. Not once in 6 years. You don't have to now if it's not what you want. It's exactly what I want." He looked at her, something steady and sure settling into his face. "I want you to know them, Clara, Sarah, and Grace. Not just as the reason I went quiet all those years, but as the family I had before you, the family that made me who I was before this ranch nearly buried that part of me for good." Clara was quiet, respectful, letting him find his own way through it. "Sarah would have liked you," Ethan said finally. "She had a sharp tongue and a sharper mind, same as you, and she never once let me get away with feeling sorry for myself, not even when I probably deserved to. Grace was only 3 when the fever took her, but she had her mother's stubbornness, already wouldn't nap unless she decided it was her own idea." His voice caught, but he pushed through it steady. "I used to think loving you would mean betraying them somehow. Took me a long while to understand it's not betrayal at all. It's just what they'd have wanted for me if either one of them could see me now." Clara reached for his hand, and this time it was her who spoke first, gentle, certain. "I don't think you're betraying anybody, Ethan. I think you're finally letting yourself live again, and I believe with my whole heart that's exactly what love looks like when it's real, not forgetting what came before, but making room for what comes after." He turned to face her fully then, and reached into his coat pocket with a hand that trembled just slightly, and Clara's breath caught when she saw what he drew out. A ring, simple, clearly old, clearly worked by hand, rather than bought from any jeweler's counter. "This was my mother's," he said. "I never gave it to Sarah. She had her own family ring, and I never had cause to think on this one again until about 2 weeks back, when I found myself hoping there might be somebody left in my life worth giving it to." He held it steady, despite the tremor in his hand, despite 15 years of guarded silence finally cracking wide open in the golden evening light. "Clara Whitmore, I've watched you walk into fire, stand down a man twice your size in courage, and rebuild a home neither of us thought we'd ever have again. I don't want to spend one more day of my life without you standing beside me for good. Will you marry me?" Clara's eyes had gone bright, and she didn't try to hide the tears that finally fully fell, 6 months of grief and struggle, and fierce, hard-won hope breaking loose all at once. "Yes," she said, no hesitation in it at all. "Yes, Ethan Callahan, 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that had gone steady now, certain, and kissed her there beneath the cottonwood tree, beside the 2 markers that held everything he'd lost, in the exact place he'd once sworn no plow or cattle would ever disturb. And somehow, impossibly, it felt entirely right that the place holding his greatest grief should also become the place holding his greatest joy. The wedding took place 3 weeks later on a bright, warm Saturday that half the county turned out for the church hall decorated with wildflowers. Clara had gathered herself from the ridgeline, and Doc Whitfield stood up to officiate on account of being the closest thing Larkspur had to both doctor and preacher when the circuit minister wasn't passing through. Frank Dell sat in the 3rd row, dressed in his best coat, having finished his community service under Doc Whitfield's oversight with a diligence that had earned him slowly but surely the town's cautious forgiveness. He'd taken a position at the land office proper, now promoted for his honesty, rather than punished for his past mistake, and he watched the ceremony with an expression of quiet, grateful relief that suggested he understood exactly how much this day represented, not just a wedding, but the final full closing of a wound he'd once helped open. Ruth Ann Colby sat near the front. The mended Sunday dress Clara had fixed for her, worn proudly, and she dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief throughout the ceremony, with a sentimentality that surprised absolutely everyone who'd known her sharp tongue for years. Sheriff Briggs stood near the back, arms crossed, wearing the satisfied expression of a lawman who'd watched justice actually take root and hold. And beside him, Sam Whitfield grinned the whole way through, delighted as ever by the drama of it all, though this time the drama was only joy. When Doc Whitfield finally pronounced them married, Ethan kissed his bride in front of the whole gathered town, and the church hall erupted into applause and whistles, and the particular warm noise of a community that had watched 2 broken people find their way slowly, and against considerable odds, into something whole. Months slipped by after that, the summer easing into a golden autumn, and then a hard, bright winter, and the ranch that had once held nothing but a lonely man's careful silence transformed season by season into something neither Ethan nor Clara had quite dared imagine possible. Clara's small sewing business grew steadily. Women from town and from the ranches below the ridge, riding up regularly, with mending and alterations, and more than one of them stayed for coffee and conversation. Afterward, the cabin that had once seen no visitors at all, now rarely quiet for long. She kept the ranch's books too precise and thorough, and more than once Ethan caught himself simply watching her work at the kitchen table in the evening lamplight, marveling at how completely his silent house had filled up with life. Frank Dell visited often, no longer the frightened, guilty young clerk who'd once stood shaking in the middle of Main Street, but a steady, respected man building a life of his own, and he brought news each visit of Holloway's continued imprisonment of the restitution, slowly making its way back to the families who'd been wronged of a county healing piece by piece from the damage one greedy man had nearly done to it. The cottonwood tree on the east parcel bloomed thick and green come spring, and Ethan took to walking out there most evenings, sometimes alone, more often now with Clara beside him, and the visits had lost the raw, unbearable weight they'd once carried. He still spoke to Sarah and Grace, sometimes quiet, private words meant for nobody else's ears, and Clara never once made him feel strange for it, understanding instinctively that love, real love, didn't require a man to choose between the family he'd lost and the family he'd found. It was late in the following summer, almost exactly a year after Clara had first collapsed at the ranch gate on a split boot and a forged letter that Doc Whitfield rode up the mountain road with news that closed the very last thread of the whole ordeal. Circuit Court finished its final business on the Holloway estate. He reported, settling onto the porch step with the easy familiarity of a frequent guest, now rather than a cautious visitor. Every family that was defrauded's been made whole far as the court could manage it. Land options returned to their rightful names. And Marsh Holloway himself has been transferred to territorial prison proper sentence, confirmed at 12 years, no chance of early release, given the arson charge attached. 12 years. Ethan said something settling, finally fully at peace in his chest. Justice took its time, Doc said, but it got where it was going. And Frank Dell's testimony carried more weight in that courtroom than I believe he ever expected it might. Judge specifically noted his cooperation as the reason the whole scheme unraveled as clean as it did. Clara, standing in this cabin doorway with a hand resting instinctively over the small, still new swell of her stomach, smiled at the news with the particular deep satisfaction of watching a long, hard fight finally completely finished. "It's strange," she said, "to think how it all began. A forged letter meant to trap a rancher into selling his land. And instead, it built an entire life neither of us knew we were missing." "That's the way of things sometimes," Doc Whitfield said, rising to leave, tipping his hat toward them both. "The Lord's got a strange sense of humor about how he brings people together. Wouldn't have picked a forged mail-order bride letter and a land fraud scheme myself, but I can't argue with how it turned out." He rode off down the mountain, and Ethan came to stand beside Clara in the doorway, his hand covering hers where it rested against the gentle curve that would come winter. Bring a new small voice into a house that had once known only silence. "A year ago today," Ethan said softly, "you walked up this road with nothing but a carpetbag and a lie somebody else told for you, and you told me you had nowhere else to go." "I remember. I've been thinking on that a great deal lately, wondering what would have happened if I'd sent you back down that mountain that first afternoon instead of catching you when you fell." Clara turned to look at him, gray eyes warm and steady, and utterly certain, exactly as they'd been the first moment she'd looked up at him from the dirt outside his gate. "You'd never have sent me away, Ethan Callahan. I knew at the moment you caught me, even half-conscious as I was. A man who catches a falling stranger before his own mind's caught up to what he's doing, that's not a man capable of turning anybody away who truly needed him." "No," Ethan agreed, drawing her close, resting his forehead against hers in the golden evening light spilling across the porch. "I don't suppose I am." He looked out over the ranch that had once held nothing but grief and silence, and 15 years of a man convinced he'd never again know what it felt like to belong to anybody. At the fence lines, standing whole and strong at the cottonwood tree, swaying gentle in the summer breeze over ground that had finally become a place of peace, instead of only sorrow at the wife who'd walked into his life on a lie and stayed to build something truer than either of them had ever dared to hope for. "I used to believe I was the man who married the mountains," Ethan said quietly. "And I told myself that was enough. Told myself a man could build a whole life out of solitude and work and just enough grief to keep him company." He pressed a kiss to Clara's temple, felt her lean into him whole and certain and entirely his. "I was wrong about that, Clara. Turns out the mountains were never what I needed. I just hadn't met the person who'd make this place worth calling home." Clara smiled against his shoulder, and out past the porch, the sun sank slow and gold behind the ridgeline that no longer belonged to greed or fear or a stranger's cruel scheme, but simply to them, to the family they'd built from nothing but courage and stubborn, unshakable hope, and to whatever came next, standing together exactly as they intended to face every single day still ahead of them. Home, Ethan understood at last, had never been the mountain at all. It had always only been her.